The Grim Drive podcast explores mental health through the lens of professional sports and athletes. Pro athletes come forward more and more with stories about their mental health journey, what they have endured, and how they managed to push through, reflecting a mental health stigma that continues to be reduced. Pro athletes also leverage mindset to achieve peak performance, as well as representing and often driving elements of popular culture through the use of social media, technology, and personal branding. This places athletes front and center as role models for people of all ages, giving them a platform to reach many and deliver important information, including information about mental health. Welcome to the Grim Dive podcast, where we explore mental health through the lens of professional sports and athletes. Today, we're going to be discussing Jackie Mac and mental health in sports media. Before we get to that, we got a couple great announcements about the Grim Drive podcast and your two hosts of the Grim Drive podcast. So one, Dimitri, I don't know if we told you this, but we finally got to 100 subscribers on YouTube. Thank you very much. Right? Only took us like harassing our entire network on social media and maybe our family and friends. But you know what? I will take it.
Hate us, yeah.
Out of that 100, I don't know how many are actual organic fans.
Right.
Doesn't matter to me.
Doesn't matter.
All right, I'll take it because with 100 subscribers, we've been begging you listeners out there to do this so that we could get our custom URL on YouTube. It's going to make copy pasting so much easier.
So much easier.
Character limits make that tough. So that's going to help us. I think it's going to help us reach more people, hopefully. So that's great news. The second part of great news is that we had a little radio spot. We were on the Radio Boston show on NPR with Tiziana Deering, where we were discussing the podcast, the Grim Drive podcast. We're talking about why we think it's important to try to shine a light on mental health through the lens of sports. I thought it went pretty well, except for my Wi-Fi cutting out briefly in the beginning. COVID needs to end. So we can just do in-person things normally. What did you think about that?
It was really exciting. I thought the questions that they had were really thoughtful. And clearly she had done a lot of research in terms of like what was needed to be talked about. I think it was just a great platform. And even from there, we got like lots of calls and pieces of people like coming from us like, oh, wow, we heard you on NPR and that's really cool what you guys are doing. And so that's like what we're here to do. Try to reach as many people as possible. So having more opportunities like that it was great. I thought the conversation went well. Yeah, I mean, you tossing out and just like quitting on it was like a little problem, but it's all right. We'll forgive you for it. No,
I recovered nicely.
You did recover nicely.
It could have gone way worse.
Way worse. But no, I thought it was really good to. I think for me also, it was good to know that there are people who were wanting to have the conversation. I think that was a big, like one of the bigger, like non-content piece takeaway, but more of like the macro piece of like that this conversation is important and there's people who are wanting to have it more. That was probably the coolest part, that we were able to like have a platform and people were actually interested. Because like sometimes we're like talking at walls or talking to people like, okay, like you get the eye rolls to that. But for people who are really interested in hearing about it, it was a really cool experience.
No, for sure. And I think we thought it went really well. And, obviously our connection is intact with the people there at WBUR, and we're hopeful that we're going to be able to do more things there because I think it seemed like it went that well, and they'd like to have us back. That's been communicated to us, which is great. So I want to thank Tiziana Deering and Chris Satorik at the Radio Boston show with WBUR and NPR. Really appreciative of them giving us that opportunity to talk about that. And we want to thank CJPR, Christina and Jules at CJPR. They really helped us kind of coordinate that and get that set up. Just another example of how you need a lot of help from different people to try to like reach the most people and help people ultimately. So we're really excited about that. Saving the best for last here, Johnny.
Oh boy.
Dimitri, John Cuna is now a published author.
Wow.
Yep.
Oh yeah, no joke, for real. John published a book called The Coaching Zone: The Next Level Leadership in Sports, along with John, it's Yeager, right?
Yep.
So discuss, John. What do you think about that?
Oh boy. So it was years of putting this all together, and it's fun. I'll give you a little backstory of how it all came together. So when I was first even thinking about getting into this field in general, I just started talking to everybody about it, and when I was sort of starting
smart way to start.
Right, just trying to like gain knowledge from people who were doing it better than I was, and who had been doing it for a while, and sports had always been something I wanted to do, and so wanting to like talk to people who had been doing that. And so I went back to my old college coach, Coach Mangiacotti, who's he's the best. Maybe I'm biased, but he's the best. He was at Wheaton when I was running, and then is now at Harvard. Mm-hmm. So I reached out to him and said, like, hey, do you know of anybody, or has Harvard worked with people who like sports psychologists or people that do that? And he got me in touch with John. And so I just sent him a random email. We connected and kind of hit it off. And then a few years later, this idea kind of spurred. And, he had been thinking about writing a book and wanted my insights of like more of the practical, like coaching stuff and like techniques and strategies. And how I was able to incorporate some of the like mental health exercises and mental fitness exercises into my coaching, because that's a big glaring gap in especially high school athletics. Mm-hmm. And so we kind of, I'd say probably like over 2 years, maybe 3 years in the making of writing this. And now finally here, I'm really, really excited about it. A little bit of, I'm not very comfortable with doing this, but it is still currently #1 on Kindle bestseller for sports psychology. So it's doing all right. No big deal. But I think what separates it from a lot of the other stuff is that it's really like a practical read. So it's more of like a template rather than like a textbook. Mm-hmm. So it sort of goes into different topics and pieces. And like there might be chapters that are like, I'm good on that, but there's
you don't
also
have to read all the way through.
To read the whole thing.
I love books like that. It's so much easier. Yeah,
it's basically just like the three big things that I was really excited about the book was when we started talking about like right feedback, right time, polarity management, and purpose development. And like right feedback, right time. I think that a lot of times coaches, when there's either a bad performance or even a good performance, you go like right up to that athlete and be like, this is what happened.
Parents do this too.
Parents do it all the time.
Yeah.
Right, exactly. And, if you're an athlete, I'm sure you can relate to this. If you've had a disappointing performance, you're beating yourself up more than probably anybody else could. And so getting feedback at that moment is probably not the most efficient and or the best time for that. And so as a coach, wanting to sort of learn when is the right time for my athletes, because maybe some athletes are like, I need it right then. Yep. Like I need to absorb everything right now, because in 10 minutes I'm going to completely move on. And so I need it right now. And some are like, I need 10 minutes to like sit with this and then I'm ready to hear it. So that was a really cool piece and goes into a lot of like very concrete exercises for that. And then polarity management is something that I think we spoke about on this podcast before. This guy named Dr. Barry Johnson wrote the book on it. And the best example I can sort of talk about is he uses the example when he's explaining it of like breathing. So inhaling and exhaling are two opposite things. You can't do them at the same time, but you need both to breathe. And it's about finding the balance between inhaling and exhaling that allow you to breathe. And so he comes up with lots of examples of what polarities exist for coaching. And one of them is like training the individual and training the team. Mm-hmm. You can't do both sort of like you can't train the individual and then also be training the team. It's about the balance of how do you do both. And you can't just focus on the team or just focus on the individual. So it goes into like practical ways to manage those things. And then the most exciting part, because this was the biggest part for me to write, was about purpose development and helping coaches understand the importance of teaching that to kids and their athletes, of how important it is to cultivate purpose.
Tapping into really what drives them.
Yeah, exactly, because ultimately it's going to make your job a heck of a lot easier. And when I was coaching, I always felt the most successful when I could like show up to a meet and didn't really have to do anything, right? Other than like timing or getting marks for jumps or things like that. It was because they knew what they were there for. They had a firm understanding of like what their purpose was, and they were motivated to do that, and they didn't need me. Mm-hmm. They were able to do those things for themselves. And that's kind of one of the bigger takeaways from the book is like, yes, these are skills that will be helpful for athletics, but it's much more about what these skills are going to do for you post athletic life. So I'm really excited that the book is out. I can't believe it's finally here. It still feels a little bit surreal. But you can go Amazon, really all those other places and download those pieces, write a review if you're feeling so inclined. Always happy to talk more about it, but really excited about the prospect. And the other cool thing, last thought, is that like I said, a lot of it is about like coaching, but it translates for lots of other different things, organizations, teams. It doesn't necessarily have to be just for athletics. My sister was talking about how she took it, she was talking about how it helped her like in her parenting.
I was going to say parents could absolutely benefit from this.
Right. So it's sort of like wide ranged and far reaching. So I'm just really excited to be able to share it. John's done an enormous amount of work on it and helping to put this all together. I would not be able to do it without him. So he's been a huge asset. He's he's done work for Harvard. He's done work for Culver. He's really hooked up with the Boston Cannons and does a lot of work for their coaching and their goalie camps. He works with Sean Quark, who's the coach for the Boston Cannons, and does a lot of work with them in their camping and their training. So he's a really well-respected guy, and I'm just honored to be able to sort of put my name next to his on something.
No, it's fantastic. We're going to put a link to that in the show notes for Amazon so people can access that book if they want to. What you touched on towards the end there also about like just the fact that it makes it easier if you coach in a certain way. It makes it easier on the athlete and the coach. I think it also makes it easier on the athlete when they're tied into purpose to be able to ride the swings of the results, right? We talk about how we can't control results, right? We can control effort, we can control process. If you're tapped into your purpose, I feel like it's a way to stay grounded, right? So that if the results aren't what you're looking for, you're not going to ride that wave as low as you would if you're really just tied to results and not tied to the bigger purpose, the bigger picture, which I think is great. You talked about right feedback, right time. I think, that to me is like, I think it's not just important for athletes or important for coaches. It's important for parents as well. And I also think that, that relates to athletes, not just in terms of when they get the feedback, but also the coaching style that they need, right? And I think some athletes, like you said, need it right away. Some need it later. Some athletes need you to be up in their face and be aggressive in terms of like, not dangerously, but aggressive in terms of the feedback you give them, and they thrive on that. Others need you to kind of, temper the way you deliver it a little bit to understand them emotionally and be able to get on their level. Every athlete is different. Jackie Mac actually talks about this in one of her Ringer appearances. She talks about, I think she mentioned, how the 76ers might be a little bit more successful this year with Doc Rivers as the coach, because he's someone who understands how to really change his coaching style depending on the player. Yeah. Referencing, I think, Ben Simmons being someone who needs you to be in his face a little bit to kind of keep him motivated, whereas Joel Embiid is not someone like that. You can kind of let him cook and do his thing. You do not need to be in his face. He's going to do what he does. So I think it kind of relates to that, to athletes in general, to coaching in general, but also to this episode. So I think that's, I just wanted to cover that. So let's see. When it comes to Jackie Mac, let's do a quick bio real quick. She is an American freelance sports journalist and NBA columnist for the sports website ESPN.com. Also works for The Ringer. I think she joined The Ringer, I want to say, in the past year. So she's on a couple different podcast episodes. She's on with the Bill Simmons podcast. I think she might be on the NBA, The Ringer NBA show, things like that. I mean, she's obviously someone who's been around for a long time and is great at what she does. In 2010, she received the Kurt Gowdy Media Award from the Naismith Memorial Basketball Hall of Fame, first woman ever to get that. Yeah. In February 2019, she was awarded the Penn ESPN Lifetime Achievement Award for literary sports writing. She graduated from UNH, where she played basketball, which is D1, so obviously no joke. Yeah. I think her passion for basketball as a player certainly feeds into her ability as a writer. And she's originally from Westwood, Mass. So shout out to the local. To the locals,
right down the street from where we are.
Yep. So in terms of, we try to always focus on whether it's an athlete or whoever we're covering in terms of the person, the personality. We try to find a charity or a charitable organization that they support. I couldn't really find one directly. I mean, I know she's done a lot of work for a whole host of different charities and volunteering and things like that. But so since we couldn't find one, we like to use hashtag Same Here. It's samehereglobal.org. They focus on global mental health awareness and reducing stigma and things along those lines. So we always like to shout out Same Here. So Jackie Mac, let's get into. We're going to talk about when it comes to, the topic is mental health in sports media. Jackie Mac is our focus. So I think when it comes to her, we're going to talk about the 5-part series she did in 2018 on ESPN. And then we're going to get into, the sports media, mental health and sports media in general, in terms of the good things, the bad things, what role they should have in that topic in general, stuff like that. So first we're going to start with the 5-part series she did. Part 1, I'm just going to, kind of preface this by going through the titles of the different parts. Part 1 was the courageous fight to fix the NBA's mental health problem. Part 2 was when making the NBA isn't a cure-all, mental health and black athletes. Part 3 is to medicate or not, the thorny mental health issue in the NBA. Part 4 is yelled at, spit on, and insulted inside the life of an NBA ref. I have some thoughts on that one, both from a fan and from a real person perspective. Yeah. And then the part 5, the last part, is Trae Young, Kevin Love, and the future of mental health in the NBA. So I'll let you start. Do you have any takeaways about Jackie Mac in general, or with regard to those 5 parts?
No, it was really cool to find out that she was like a Massachusetts person. That was kind of cool. But in terms of like what my biggest takeaway from her is that she's really one of the only people that I could find that's really doing a lot of this type of work. There are definitely other journalists who are doing more, and I would say especially within the last 5 years, there's been more. But she really, she feels like she's the spearhead for it, of like trying to really shine some light on these types of things and really do good work. Aside from the fact that she's just a phenomenal journalist and writer, I think that she has a really unique ability to hone in on like the most necessary conversations and topics. And if you go, I highly recommend going and watching the 5-part series on YouTube. They're not very long, but she is like very talented at like getting into like the nitty gritty of what needs to be talked about. And you can tell by the people that are on, especially that first one with Kevin Love, it's just like pouring out of him, of like all the stuff that's going on. And she does a really great job holding that. And we'll get into some other journalists who maybe aren't as good at doing that. But I think that because she's allowed and because she's good at what she does, the conversation's been more fluid and available. And I think that, we're going to get into other people who don't have that same ability. But having people like her has helped the conversation of mental health in sports to even happen and occur. And so that was her ability to do that, and we'll go through the different places and the 5 takeaways. But that was sort of like jaw dropping for me when I was watching her sort of like do her magic when talking to these people and like covering these articles and things like that. I was like, wow, she has such a unique way of getting to like the root stuff in a way that feels approachable and not like over the top or that type of stuff. It was really it was impressive.
Yeah, one might say she has the demeanor of a therapist.
Yeah,
a little bit.
Maybe that's what it is. Maybe that's why I align so much.
Totally. There's some people that are like really fantastic at interviewing other people, right? I think Oprah is someone that's obviously like at the top of that kind of game.
Yeah.
Bill Simmons is also someone at The Ringer who's fantastic at knowing how to interview people. Joe Rogan is someone who can people that can not only get people to open up, but are really well versed in different areas and know kind of where to take it. I think Jackie Mac obviously has that, and she's, I don't know how to describe it. She's like part therapist, part mom, part journalistic genius. Like it's all 3. And when you see her talking with someone or letting them talk really and guiding them in a way from the interviewer kind of perspective, it really is like she's super skilled, and it makes you like, you can see why people kind of open up. And she made a comment like, I could always get people to tell me stuff that they wouldn't tell anybody else. So this is like, she started when, I still don't think it's probably all that easy. I don't know from personal experience for obvious reasons, but being a female journalist in, largely or entirely male locker rooms dating back to the 70s or 80s for her, I think 80s, that could not have been easy, right? So doing that period I was sure was a huge challenge, but doing it as successfully as she's done and developing that kind of trust and getting those athletes to open up to her for a very long time has something she's always been good at. And I mean, she seems to get the role that emotion plays in what drives people. That's what kind of stood out to me and she talks about that, like how it's not, she goes beyond the sport and even beyond like just the intricacies of one person. I think she gets into what you talk about purpose with your book and that purpose development. Yeah. I think she kind of taps into the emotion and the core of what's kind of going on in a person. Ultimately, I think human beings are kind of emotional beings that think, and oftentimes we're characterized as the opposite, like thinking beings that happen to have some emotions, and it's really the reverse. And I think when you tap into someone's emotion, you really get what moves them, and you can get them to open up about things. I know we have to do that, obviously, in our work, and it's a struggle, it's a challenge. Every person is a kind of a unique puzzle. I think she's super skilled at that. So I agree with you. That's definitely something that kind of stood out. In terms of the 5 parts, any one of the 5 that you want to start with in terms of thoughts you had?
I feel like the first part was all about Kevin Love, and I feel like we've had pretty good conversations about that. I'd encourage people to sort of go back and listen to our first episode, I think it was Kevin Love. So
well, and that gives me a thought. It's just that all these sort of things keep intertwining. I think the more episodes we do, we kind of keep finding these little nuances about this person was connected to this person and helped them open up about this. And it was Jackie. I didn't know Jackie Mac. Like her question to him is kind of what seemed to originate his kind of journey. Right. I didn't know that at all. No. So I thought that was absolutely great point.
Yeah. One of the ones that stood out to me was about medication.
Totally.
that was a really well written piece. And one of the things that stood out was, so Dr. Parham is the guy that the MBA union brought on as sort of like to oversee mental health pieces. And one of the things he said was that, medication treats the symptoms, not the real issues.
Yeah, it stood out to me too. Yeah.
And that was a powerful thing to hear from a provider in that, like, overseeing something, because I've definitely worked with providers who don't think that. And it was refreshing to hear like a person in that position who's like thinking about it in the right way. And it also made me think of like why I think a lot of times, especially with medication in our field, it's like, take this pill, things are fixed. And I see it of more like, take this pill so that we can get to work. And I think that it's
on the
nice,
real underlying
on the
issues.
real stuff, right?
Yeah,
I mean, the medication really is meant to allow you to come to a place where you can actually do the work, right? To stabilize brain, the chemistry, whatever it happens to be, stabilize so that you can actually access the things that you weren't able to beforehand. And so seeing him, that statement was like really, really stood out to me. And I think that having more, because people are going to look to him, he's respected in his field, and hopefully that starts to trickle down of the approach and more of the understanding, because I have that conversation a lot with people who potentially are going to be going on to medication of, well, do I need to see you anymore? Or do we need to keep working together anymore? Like, I'm taking this pill. Like, am I good?
Yeah.
And having to have a conversation, no, right? Like, no, not really.
I wish,
right? And then, I think that does speak to like the instant gratification that has become more sort of apparent in our culture of like, okay, I got to keep moving, so I'll just take this pill and everything's going to be better. And so, having him say that, he also must understand that like there's going to be some real work that has to be done, and that work is the value and is the process and is actually what is going to strengthen you, because that's the work. That's what the pill just allows you to get to a place you can actually do that.
Yeah.
It has to be sort of in conjunction, and hearing him make that statement was like a comforting feeling of like, oh, okay, like this guy's got a really good sense of what to do and how to go about it.
Totally. And even if the pill was guaranteed to like majority handle the issue,
sure,
I still find problems with that a little bit. And I'll give an example. Like, let's say someone can, you're struggling, you're paying your bills, but you have goals and you're trying to kind of work your way up and develop good habits in life, develop a work ethic, things like that, especially when you're younger. Let's say you have a parent that just kind of gives you $1 million, right? $2 million, $3 million maybe. That seems good on the surface, right? And you see parents struggle with this a lot. Parents that are successful, they say something like, "I don't want my kid to struggle like I did," and a warning kind of flag goes off in my head when I hear that, because what they often ignore, and it's not that you want your kid to struggle to the point where they're compromised health wise,
right? But
you also don't want to completely pave everything for them, because the struggle is important. You need that. That's what kind of develops, a foundation. It develops your work ethic. It develops sustainability for you in life, so that when life hits you, you're able to kind of recover, gain strength, and move on and move forward.
Right.
If everything is paved out for you, including from a financial standpoint, it actually sets people up for some risk later on, because they're not able to really recover when things don't go their way. So I think medication is not necessarily the same. But I think there's very real value in doing the work to really get to the root of the issue. If people believe that medication is really just going to solve all their problems, they're missing the key point, which is that nothing is that easy, and you have to be able to put in the hard work, because that's what's going to sustain you later on when things do dip a little bit, which they're naturally going to, right? Life throws stressors at us.
Absolutely. You bring up a good point about the like, I don't want my kids to struggle like I did, because that's the same thing. I hear that a lot, and I understand, as a parent, I understand, right? I get it. I get why of course you don't want your kids to struggle, right?
Yeah.
But then it's always, I'll take that same comment and kind of flip it and be like, well, do you attribute some of your success to your struggle? Right. And then you can kind of get them to access of like, well, yeah, I had to work like 100 hours a week, and I had to learn what that felt like, and I had to manage, and I had to figure out how to time manage. I had to do all these different things because I was struggling and working so hard. And it's like, well, do you think you picked up some lessons of why, did you think those contributed to some of your success?
Yeah.
And you can kind of flip that whole paradigm, because I think that's one of those comments that like is just out there and accepted. But when you actually dissect it, there's some real problems to it. And that's definitely one that I think is like regurgitated a lot within like the parents' fear of like, oh, I don't want my kids to struggle. And it's like, well, no, you got to let them struggle a little bit, or they're not going to know how to, because life is not just, maybe there are some examples of people who never have to struggle, and I'm sure there are. But for the majority, there's always going to be something that's going to come up. And if you are never given opportunities to struggle, you're not going to know how to do it.
Totally. And I think the way I would describe it is like and I've talked to parents about this, is a key difference between difference between wanting your kid to be safe and not wanting them to struggle. I think those are two very different things. We want kids to be safe, but we also want them to have the right type of struggle because it's going to set them up for success and happiness, which ultimately makes them safe, right? And I think when parents are really super concerned with removing all struggle, what they're really kind of guarding against is their own negative emotions. That's really what that's about. It's about their own fear, about not wanting something bad to happen to their kid. And I think once they tap into that, they can realize, okay, that's much more about me than it is about my kid's actual safety. Now that I know that, I can manage my own emotions, learn how to cope in an effective way, and balance out their safety versus their necessary struggle. Yeah. And try to balance. I mean, it's an imperfect balance. Not always possible to get both.
And it's super hard. It's like counterintuitive for a parent to tell a parent, like, don't care for your kid who's struggling, right? It's like, no, that's my job as a parent, is to help my kid in any way that I possibly can. And the hard part of that conversation is like, well, you know what, the best thing you can do to help is to allow a little bit of struggle. And that's a very uncomfortable feeling for parents to sit in. Like, you hold your baby for the first time, it's crying. What do I got to do to help this baby stop crying, right? It's like, it's just programmed, and you have to sort of like deprogram that and like work to how are these actually supporting my kids, or are they actually supporting my kids?
Absolutely. So you bring up that part 3, that the medication part of this really was the one that kind of stood out the most to me as well. And that quote in particular, that often meds treat symptoms, not the real issue, definitely stood out. There were a couple of things along those lines. I think under the heading of medication, the topic of medication, I would also put, self-medicating. And I think that includes alcohol and marijuana or cannabis. I think, we know how problematic alcohol is. And Marcus Morris, actually, who was referenced in part 2, but also in part 3, talked about how until he got connected with a psychologist through I forget the name, but through somebody, through the Celtics organization in the greater Boston area, it was a female psychologist. Before he got connected to her, he admits to using marijuana to try to deal with his depression. And then someone else, unsuccessfully, and once he started working with her, he realized that was not going to solve the problem and not going to get to the real root of the issue. So I think this medications and, alcohol and marijuana really treat the surface thing that gets you by on a day-to-day basis, especially marijuana. There was someone who, I don't know if it was Doc Rivers or someone else in that part 3 who referenced how, I think it was John Lucas. Right? Who is a very well-known, he was a basketball player, basketball coach in the NBA, but also is well-known as kind of a mentor guru these days in the last 10 years especially. He's someone who referenced how, marijuana is tricky because it's going to help you get through day to day, but the negative effects don't show up immediately. And I've definitely seen that with people where it's like it kind of tricks you into thinking it's okay to keep using that because it staves off major issues from happening on one given day, but then issues slowly start to form. And he references how it kind of saps your drive and motivation and that kind of stuff. So I think it's important because once Marcus Morris got connected to treatment, he realized that, I got to do something else to really handle the root. Yeah. That's just kind of getting me through, right? And then the other thing, Doc Rivers referenced ADHD. I think how him and Danny Ainge were both kind of diagnosed within the Celtics organization as having ADHD, and it kind of made me laugh because I think we obviously have done a lot of work with ADHD, and we know how intelligent people with ADHD are and how high performing they tend to be. And it just this really hit home for me. I think it was already hitting home, but it's starting to sink in even more. How neurodiversity and even sometimes certain mental health issues kind of set some of these athletes up to be like super successful from the athletic perspective. That's something I never really knew going into this podcast was how often that happens, I think, which is, obviously a dangerous thing on the flip side of that and on the back end, especially when they retire, which we've discussed. Yep. But kind of cool that neurodiversity in different ways really aids them as an athlete. And I find that that's cool because we're obviously strengths-based, strengths-focused. And it's easy to just paint mental health or mental illness or things like that as all bad, but there are some things that actually help them in certain ways, and it's about finding that balance, I think.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. I think especially though, like I think we've had conversations about this too, of like mental health seeing as like if you have it, it's bad, right? Like mental illness is bad, right? And so like I talk about this with my clients all the time. Like I don't really ADHD. Like I have a hard time seeing as like a disorder. I know it's called like
deficit
disorder,
I hate
right?
both those.
Right. I don't see it as a deficit, and I don't see it as disorder. I think it certainly contributes to make things more difficult in certain areas, but. I mean, gosh, the list of people with ADHD who are highly successful in their fields grows every single day. Yeah. And that's not a coincidence when you're seeing all these different people. I think because the symptoms of it lend itself to drive, purpose, focusing creativity, imagination, all these different things. And when you're given the permission to think of it as a strength rather than this baggage that you're carrying around, you then get to lean into like utilizing those skills rather than like being ashamed that they're there.
Totally.
And so I think you bring up a great point because it's a conversation. I know we've talked about this a lot, but it just keeps coming up in all of our conversations, and I don't think that's a coincidence.
I agree. And deficit to me is just like I hate both those terms. I don't think they're relevant. Deficit is kind of like just false. I mean, if you think about it, it's actually more like attention overload. Right. More than a deficit. Like you're able to focus on a lot of
obtain
things at
everything.
Once, which makes it hard to focus on one thing, but it's not really a deficit. If anything, it's like a wider scope. Which I think is what allows people with ADHD often to be successful entrepreneurs and other things like that.
Absolutely, because you can be focused on all these different things, and when you learn how to synthesize it into single focus, you're able to process like hundreds of things versus just like a single thing. Yeah,
so and you might say that not having ADHD at times and really being kind of pigeonholed into singular focus is a bit of a deficit in a lot of ways, especially in the business world. I think in my opinion, our economy has kind of gotten to a place where it definitely rewards people who have the ability to think creatively and think outside the box and generate new ideas, especially with social media and things like that. And I think it's to me, there's never been a better time to be someone that has ADHD. Because I think it really is kind of a superpower in different ways that we talk about.
Yeah.
Part 4.
Go ahead. Lay it on me, John.
I feel like I need like a fan therapy session, dude. Like, because if I'm taking the therapist hat off, I'm really just taking the normal everyday person hat off and just going into fan mode, which fan is short for fanatic. Okay. It means we're not logical.
Right.
And we go a little bit out there. Okay. With our allegiances and that kind of thing, groupthink. I am not logical when I'm a fan. And when I'm watching, especially the NBA, I think the refs are absolutely terrible. Particularly towards the Celtics. I mean, I know I'm a homer, but my goodness, like I can't. I've watched NBA League Pass this year. I've seen other games. I'm telling you, the same stuff doesn't happen. I don't know what it is. Who's the guy? Daniel Tice.
Yeah.
Okay. Have you seen his stats from after he got traded?
Yeah.
This dude was anytime he breathes on someone, called for a foul on the Celtics. I think in his first 3 games, he wasn't called for a single foul on the Bulls. So if that doesn't prove there's a discrepancy here, I don't know what does.
Yeah.
I'm venting too much.
I'm going to give you the space. I'm just going to give you the space. Get it out.
I feel like, on the one hand, from a fan's perspective, it's like I don't have a whole lot of pity for refs because I think that they just need to get better at what they do, in my opinion. If I take that fan hat off, then I realize, like, especially reading this article, you recognize these are real people, and it must be brutal, especially.
It's an impossible job.
Oh, totally. Especially from an NBA perspective, I think it's different. Like when you think of the size of the field with football and baseball, and even hockey, you got boards and plexi and you can't hear anything. NBA is like, there's courtside people. You are right there. You have big stripes on your shirt. There's no hiding yourself. You are like bearing all for a lot of people that no matter what you do are going to hate you. That has to have a psychological impact. And that article, the 4th part, really talks about some of these refs and what they go through. And it made me think a little bit differently about my fan side. What do you think?
Yeah, same. And I'm the same. When you always remember the bad calls. You never remember the fact that like for 58 minutes they called a good game, right? And I think oftentimes, majority of the times, like the loss or the win is placed on the calls of a referee, which is just everybody's not perfect. And now and then it's you say, like, well, let's do more reviews and then like more instant replays and stuff like that. And then people are complaining about that, and they still get them wrong, and it's like it's this impossible balance. But I think that being a referee is an impossible job. Impossible.
It's thankless.
It's thankless. You're never going to be like, that was such a great non-call, or like that was such a good call. Like that you only are blowing your whistle when something is wrong. You're never blowing your whistle being like, great pass, right, or anything like that. And so it's not. It's a really difficult position to be in. I think the NBA is difficult because there's I have my own issues with referees, especially in the NBA, because there's a lot of like, if you miss a call, they're going to do like makeup calls later on. Totally. Soft. There's like this. There's call management toward
the end of the game to make it look like less of a discrepancy.
Yeah, and there's lots of stuff that goes into it. It's just like, well, just call a consistent game, and if you're going to allow something on one end of the court, allow it for the other side. And I think that Of course, it's different for the Celtics, right?
Yeah.
Obviously, they're the harshest with the Celtics, and that's definitely not because I'm a Celtics fan. But that I'm looking for this consistency. But reading that, it forces you to take that fan hat off and be like, oh yeah, this is an actual person who you watch the replays and they're just like somebody who's like 7 feet tall, massive in their face, screaming at them at the top of their lungs. Yeah. You just sort of like write that off as like, oh, it's part of their job. But if I were in that same position and a big, massive person is screaming at me, that would be tough. And to have, and just once, let alone.
Well, I have a question
times.
for you on this one, because I was at the game recently, Celtics versus 76ers. Okay. Now, you know where the root, okay, we're talking about the root of problems, right? Not just the surface. The root of my fandom, anti-ref bias goes no further than Joel Embiid. Okay, he is like at the crux of it. If you removed him, I don't even think I'd have an issue. But I have a major problem I have to figure out when it comes to my mood and my demeanor when it comes to seeing him play. I almost can't go. It's that bad. Like I almost can't. If they face them in the playoffs, I might avoid those games and watching them on TV too. I just don't know if I can take it. I don't think my mental health can actually take any more of that.
Yeah.
What confuses me, this is my question for you, is from a psychological perspective, it kind of fascinates me because Joel Embiid, if I was a ref, he'd be the guy who I'd be least likely to give to a call. Not just because I'm a Celtics fan,
right?
Just in terms of what he does. I mean, he even when he gets a call, he complains.
Yeah,
goes right to the ref, complains, kind of demeans them a little bit in passive aggressive kind of way. And when he doesn't get a call, forget about it. I mean, it's like he pouts and he stomps and things like that. And yet he gets all these calls. And I don't think it's just a superstar thing. I don't know what it is, because then you have other guys that are kind of not on his level, but are stars, right? Mm-hmm. Especially Tatum and Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown. They're, top 20, top 30 players in the league. And they're actually pretty low-key and mild-mannered. Tatum kind of throws his hands up after he gets him, but he's not like he's demonstrative. Mm-hmm. And they get no calls. And so I wonder, is that just a fluke? Or is it like, what do you think from a psychological perspective makes refs actually more likely to give a player a call versus not?
Yeah, it's a good question. I have to give that one some thought. I don't really know if I always sort of attribute if you're in the top 10, you're going to get calls if you're driving the lane.
LeBron's going to get calls.
LeBron's going to get calls. Harden's going to get calls. Yeah. Westbrook, all those guys, they're going to get calls because they're the elite. Giannis, same thing. So, Giannis. So, but from a psychological standpoint, it'd be really interesting, to do interviews or to do some talk to referees about some of that stuff. It'd be really curious of what in the moment where it was going through your head of giving that call versus not beforehand. Was there a sense of oh shoot, I don't want to get yelled at and they'll give the call or not? You would hope that it would not be a part of it, but everybody's human, and I can't imagine we all have biases, and I would be really, really fascinated to learn about it. That will never happen, I'm sure.
I'm throwing our hats in the ring, okay?
Yeah, sure.
NBA, come on,
right?
Yeah,
come on our show.
If you're listening, what's the commissioner's name? Adam Silver?
Yeah.
If you're listening, Adam Silver, we're willing. We are available at any time, okay? Because it fascinates me. It really does. And I think one example that comes to mind is I think I referenced this in the past episode, but there was another a Malcolm Gladwell podcast where they talk about court judges and how they are way more fierce with their sentencing right before lunch than compared to after lunch when you neutralize all the other variables because they're hungry. So it's there's something going on, specifically with all refs, but specifically with NBA refs, that I feel like can be remedied, and I think we should be considered. I really think we could. Now,
all in.
I can't guarantee that. Well, no, I can put my Celtics bias to the side if I have to, because I think it's worth it. It's that important of a thing. Yeah. So maybe we'll see. I doubt our door is going to be knocked on anytime soon. But,
I doubt it.
So we covered parts 3 and part 4. We talked about part 1. It's kind of like the Kevin Love kind of the origin of mental health and the NBA in terms of where that topic started. I think it was mostly DeMar DeRozan and Kevin Love. We obviously covered those in our first 2 episodes. You get into part 2 was about Marcus Morris, the Morris twins, really, growing up in North Philly. I went to architecture school in North Philly. It's a very, very rough area, and obviously they speak to the different things that are valued there and what it's like, what life is like. And I think it's kind of scary to read about. I mean, you recognize that clearly what came through is just this individual and collective trauma that especially members of the Black community, particularly in communities that are a lot of the members of the community are living below the poverty line. It's brutal. I mean, it's you don't feel safe walking out your front door, and you clearly like making eye contact and things like. To me, it takes the whole men's playbook to a different level, right?
Yeah.
We talk, I mean, no, guys in
Different
general,
playbook.
yeah, it's like the way next level.
Yeah.
Like guys in general are kind of taught like don't show emotion, don't show weakness. But in these communities, it's not just like, hey, you're gonna get made fun of. It's like you could be in danger if you do. And I think we talked about this in the DeMar DeRozan episode too. But it really comes through, and you recognize how traumatic that is, in any given moment, but for their childhood, and it sets them up for a lot of mental health challenges later on.
Yeah, I agree. And they talked about how like, having that one thing, you had to protect it, and with your life, and really not meaning like that, not an exaggeration or not a turn of phrase, like really, like you had to protect, like your life was dependent on like that one thing, and for them it was basketball, and they had to like protect that with their lives because that was what the thing was going to be to help them get from where they were. And I think that their story is probably very similar to lots of people's story in there who live in a situation that they do of like, this is my ticket out of here. And I think we've talked about this in the past, that a lot of times that what helps you in the moment get to where you want to get to doesn't always necessarily mean that that's what is going to help sustain, and especially afterwards, because I think a lot of times for these types of situations, it's like, okay, I don't focus on anything else other than basketball and getting me out of this situation. And then when you're out of that situation, you don't need to live that life that way anymore, and you can start to sort of feel maybe a little bit safer. And so it was cool to read the two experiences. And Marcus, I believe, was a little more outspoken about sort of some of the stuff that he had went through, especially as a kid. But again, it was just it's refreshing to hear those stories because, and Kevin Love talked about it with Jackie Mac in their interview too, of like, LeBron after the game coming up to him was like, you helped so many people tonight, right? And he was like, I wasn't really what I was expecting, but the same thing, like another example of someone coming out and talking about some of this stuff to give permission to the next person or to the youth, or maybe not even a pro player, just anybody, to give them permission to be like, oh, I'm not alone in this situation, and there's ways that I can get help. And I think that new pipeline is such a huge move forward, and just hopeful that it can continue to kind of follow that trend.
Yeah, specifically because, he's a role model for anyone else who's grown up in a community like that and has gone through that type of experience. They can now, instead of looking around and seeing people that are telling them they aren't safe and they can't open up and they can't, they now have someone like Marcus Morris who's opening up and does come from that background. That is very important, for people to see, like-minded people and people from similar backgrounds to be able to have as a role model, and someone who can kind of show them that there's a different way to kind of handle things.
Yeah, just representation.
Absolutely. Yeah. And the other thing that came through is just that, twins. I mean, twins being separated, I think obviously twins in general, but like they clearly relied on each other to keep themselves safe. To then have to go, we talked about adjustment in this past episode with Shamika Holtzclaw, to have to go to a new life with more money in a different city, not knowing anybody, is hard enough. Then you get split up from your twin brother, who's like the main rock you have. That was clearly difficult for them. And then when they got traded back to reunited on the Phoenix Suns, I think they both improved. They were both in a much better place, which I don't think is a coincidence. So that definitely stands out. So we've covered most of them. Part 5 was about Trae Young, Kevin Love, and the future of mental health in the NBA. And I think they talked about some cool things because they referenced Trae Young went to school at Oklahoma, and they referenced that program and how they have like a groundbreaking mental wellness platform for all of their incoming student athletes. And that was really cool because I don't know that all colleges have that. I don't think they do. I could be wrong. And I think that's going to set the tone for more colleges to do that, which is really needed because I think mental health in college, not just for athletes, but also for students in general, is kind of an area that we're interested in because, they charge a ton of money for tuition, and yet they really don't provide a ton of support when it comes to the mental health side of things. Never has that been more important than during a pandemic and other stuff. So what did you think about that episode?
Yeah, and to that point, I like that episode a lot. It was refreshing to hear, like with that Oklahoma State is doing that type of stuff. I think you hear about like pro level teams when they're like onboarding like rookies and their new like farm systems, especially in baseball, like they have those types of programs there, but that's the pro level, right? And like what 0.01% of people who make pros, especially in baseball, so that of that population, you're only serving that amount of people. So that was kind of nice to hear that there's programs out there that are doing some of that work.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it kind of brings up the difference between college and pro is obviously the money piece. I mean, we can get into the whole should college athletes be paid. We can cover that some other time because that's a very long topic to cover. But in part one, Danny Ainge was actually quoted as saying, like, we can offer help, but if they don't take it, et cetera, like, not much we can do, which there's truth to that, but also it brings up the whole point of, like, do athletes trust that, these teams are providing something that's confidential? And that confidentiality piece was something that kind of wove through a lot of these parts, with players saying, like, that has to be paramount, because there were owners that said, like, we want access to those medical records, which is, like, a huge no-no when it comes to mental health, but health in general, and no employer should really have access to that. So, so we're gonna shift this a little bit into the mental health and sports media. I mean, we've covered some of this already, but in terms of, like, the things that stand out to me, and I'll kind of get it kicked off, and then we'll kind of go back and forth a little bit. Just how far things have come since 2018. I mean, I know we had talked on NPR, and we talked about in past episodes on how there's probably a lot of different athletes that had a role in the start of this stigma being reduced and it being more prevalent for athletes to come out. We talked about, like, Meta World Peace in 2010 and Brandon Marshall in 2011. 2018 was kind of like where it all seemed to kind of hit a tipping point, which is really awesome. This is where DeMar DeRozan and Kevin Love kind of came out and talked about stuff. Clearly, Jackie Mac was integral in that. So to me, it's like Jackie Mac is kind of in a past generation when it comes to, like, sports media, but still sort of, like, in both. I mean, she originated in the 80s, but is still very much prevalent in sports media now. I feel like the new generation of sports media, younger sports media members who grow up in a culture where mental health is more and more, understood. I think that's like a kind of an area for them to utilize a little bit instead of being so clickbait driven. I think one of the major problems with media these days, which is why athletes especially take it upon themselves to be the drivers of their own kind of brand and platform media narrative.
Yep.
One of the reasons they do that is because of how clickbaitish, media has become. So what do you think? I mean, I feel like that's an area where the new generation could really utilize that to balance things out.
Yeah, I think having it be more of a conversation and less so. I think that a lot of the older generation, we've talked about Skip Bayless before and his comments about Dak Prescott of, like, go out and play football and don't talk about your whatever, which obviously not great, and he got pretty ridiculed by that, as he should have. Yeah. And so I think it's a really hard balance. I think it's a balance that we try to do on this show of, like, talking about people's mental health but not speculating.
Yeah.
And I think that that's a really hard thing to balance for a media person. But I think that
we do this for a living,
right?
So in terms of, like, the mental health side, yeah,
right.
Yeah.
And so for a sports media person, I think in terms of, like, their responsibility, I think it's just like anything else. It's just information that if the person has sort of talked about it, for them to be able to sort of have a better understanding of what might be going on. And I think that really what they could do a better job is of, like, incorporating more of this stuff to, like, humanize the athletes more. And I think that we've talked about this a lot, that from, like, a fan perspective, it's more enjoyable if I'm watching like humans rather than, like, they are athletes, but if I see them as human beings, it's more enjoyable.
Yeah.
And I think
and it's real and it's authentic, as opposed to, like, some headline that's clearly, like, when I see a clickbaity headline, if, like, to me, I lose respect for that media person or that journalist, and it makes me not want to really consume what they have to offer.
Yep.
I don't think it really helps their brand or their kind of upward mobility either.
No, definitely not. And a lot of the clickbait stuff, like, you'll click it and it has nothing to do with the actual headline, or it's not accurate or true.
Right. Well,
like,
sometimes they don't choose the headlines, I guess. So maybe, but still, I think, like, it's on the companies too.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's lots of different problems. I think that, like, the goal would be this newer generation being able to, like, have more language around how to talk about these things if it's present. But again, like, finding that balance of not going into speculating. So if there's a player who has bipolar, not being like, that's why they had a bad game, right? Yeah. And I think that because that's super problematic. But having it be, like, understanding of, like I said, like, helping to humanize the person of, like, oh, this person has this and that's going on for them.
Yeah, and it brings up a great question, because it's, like, one of the things I wanted to ask you today was, like, should it be the responsibility of sports media to understand mental health nuance? And that's a tough one. What do you think?
I struggle with it, because I think that they're, in terms of, like, what they're responsible for doing, I think it's, if you're being a good journalist and you're talking about an athlete, you should do your research, and it should be maybe a part of what's going on. But then on the other hand, it's like, that's confidential information for the person who might not, if they haven't spoken up about it, then obviously you can't, talk about those things. But I think that having an understanding of it would be really helpful so that you don't get into situations like Skip Bayless was in when Dak Prescott was talking about suicide and talking about like sadness and like all these different things, and for him to make a comment about like just go play football.
Yeah.
You know, that is not a helpful conversation for anybody. It stops the conversation from trying to be had. It stigmatizes, it belittles, it degrades. And so, I think helping give maybe sports media a more understanding of like if those things come up, how to talk about them, like giving them language might be something that I do think that's part of their responsibility. I don't think it's like, oh, I don't know how to do it, so I'm just not going to do it. Like, I think it's your responsibility to educate yourself on how to if it comes up.
Well, I agree, and I think so. I think they should try to get educated so they have some balance, right? So they're informed, while also like us, recognizing collectively that it's not on them to become licensed mental health professionals.
No, of course not. Right.
And I think media members in general are always going to be at risk to be prone to a little bit of negativity and a little bit of sensationalizing. I think it kind of goes with the field. So I think as fans and as consumers, we kind of have to at least allow for a little bit of that, just because that's what drives that sort of market and that field. And it's always going to be that way.
Yeah.
I think if we get too up in arms about like, them fixating on one element or that without understanding that it's kind of like on us to be realistic a little bit.
I agree.
So what I think might help is like, sometimes they call in, I've seen them call it whether it's on Twitter, them featuring kind of like medical doctors that can kind of give some perspective of an injury that was that took place on the field, what it means for their recovery, how long that might take. Why not do that with mental health? I mean, I've never seen that when it comes to, so they don't have to know all this stuff. But, these shows and especially the producers should bring in, I'll throw our hat in the ring if they want to, and if they need it, I'll do it,
Happy to.
Bring in some mental health professionals. It doesn't have to be us, obviously. It could be, I think these like really high-level psychologists that have clearly connected with these athletes that are referenced. Like, why not feature some of them and bring them in on when it comes to a topic so that it's not on the sports media personalities to know all this stuff. Because you can't be an expert in everything. If you're an expert as a sports media analyst, that's what your area is. Like, it's unfair of us to expect them to be experts in mental health.
Right.
So take some pressure off them. Bring in a mental health expert to just discuss this from a certain angle to give it some balance. And then I feel like it also is good for the producers in the company because it will take the edge off the tendency to go way too in the direction of sensationalism and things like that.
Yeah.
Everybody wins. I mean, like it balances all the negative stuff that will get you like. I mean, Skip Bayless got torn apart after that last one, which it shows how things have shifted.
Yeah.
And I think, sports media companies and producers need to pay attention to that because if they're not, I think it's going to cost them viewers if they're not careful. So it really doesn't, there's no downside to bringing that in. Like you said, it also makes, it endears the athlete to the viewer. Why wouldn't you want to do that? You get on their level more. It makes you feel more connected as a fan. So
it protects the analyst too, like from making comments like Skip did. Yeah.
Or if they do, a mental health professional will be really good at not jumping down the throat of someone like Skip Bayless. They probably provide some context,
right?
Although it's hard to know with guys like Skip because sometimes they know exactly what they're doing. I didn't get the vibe with this one. I feel like he's just kind of ignorant when it comes to mental health.
Yeah.
Generational kind of thing.
Yeah, I agree.
But sometimes they know exactune what they're doing, and that's why they get paid because it's designed to get, again, clicks and shares, and that, even if it's negative. So
tune into Felger and Mazga at any point. You'll know what we're talking about.
For anyone local,
anyone local.
That goes like just a whole other degree about like just placating to people's proneness to be negative. My goodness. Never said a positive thing in their entire careers. So obviously there's some members of the media that are more negative. I think Skip Bayless, Stephen A. sometimes is a little bit maybe misinformed about mental health and stuff like that. Some good ones. I think Mina Kimes is someone that definitely really seems to understand the mental health angle and how that relates to people and athletes and the fan experience too. Jackie Mac, Darren Ravel is someone who's been involved with Same Here, which we're big on that organization. So they're doing a podcast now with Theo Fleury. And that kind of ties in, athletes, mental health awareness, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, Brandon Marshall too.
Great one. Yeah. He's also a former athlete, as is Theo Fleury, I think. So for sure. So there's definitely some really good ones that are doing some great stuff now. We don't want to focus just on the negative. We want to focus on the positive too. And I think it's shifting in the right direction. And sometimes these things just don't, as much as we want them to change on a dime, like cultural shifts don't change like that. It's incremental, and all we can do is try to balance the discussion and narrative so that it changes in the right at the right pace. So I think that's it for today. So normally we ask people to subscribe to YouTube, but guess what, Dimitri? We don't have to do that anymore. Just kidding. You should still subscribe. But we do have 100, so we're getting our custom URL. So I guess we could also, if you want to find me, I'm on Twitter. I have like a whopping 30 followers, John.
Woo!
Okay, but
Careful.
one of them is Bob Oakes from WBUR. Okay, I'm very proud of that.
There you go.
Yep. I did thank him. We had a little back and forth. No big deal. So you can find me on Twitter at Jotham, LIZSW. I'm also on Instagram at Jotham Busfield. John, any place people can reach you about the book or anything like that?
Yeah, John B. Cuna on Instagram, and then you can follow our Riser and Tread Instagram tag too for any updates or pieces like that we're doing.
Absolutely. So thanks everyone for listening to this episode of the Grim Drive podcast for our discussion about Jackie MacMullan and mental health in sports media. We will be back next week to talk about Julie and Jack Ertz and relationships.